I think you're going to like this, because today you're going to get my hidden puzzle piece in the history of the invention of the iPhone. I was able to discover a large piece of history on YouTube and see how my piece of history fits. And I've got comments turned on for this video. Sorry kids, if I want to get comments, YouTube restricts this video to you. There's some good stuff coming up, so let's get started. First, let me share my piece of the puzzle. Up until now, I've listed myself as probable inventor of the iPhone, and I'm also the one that brought the Apple brand power idea that saved Apple from bankruptcy in 2001. I have links to both projects, as well as how they were done, in the video description. So why the word probable inventor? Well, I didn't have a view from inside Apple from that time period until now. But now I found some history videos on YouTube. But what new history will you get from me in this video? My puzzle piece gives a view from the inner circle at Apple. That's Apple's Mr. Inside, Fred Hoare, and Apple's Mr. Outside, Regis McKenna. So what I know is that after the dot-com bust in about 2001, I was put in touch with one of Apple's inner circle guys, Mr. Inside, Fred Hoare, and gave him an idea that instantly got about $1 million of angel funding. That is, a cellular phone as a point-of-sales device. The other person named on the funded project was the son of Mr. Outside, Regis McKenna. You can see the point-of-sales idea with music leads to iTunes, which sells music through a phone, and with apps, the App Store, which sells apps through a phone. And if the iTunes idea was known way early, the strategy that we see in the iPhone history makes a lot more sense. And knowing the App Store idea way early makes the strategy that we see in that history make sense too. But since my idea was already in the inner circle of Apple, why do I need the qualification of probable inventor? Where is the gap? Well, I was missing the view from inside Apple during those years, so there's uncertainty to me what happened to the idea. Could the iTunes idea have come in partly through an acquisition? Today's videos will show other ideas coming into Apple through acquisitions, but not iTunes and not the App Store. And we see both ideas coming into the strategy quite early. After I found one video on the history of the iPhone, I was able to find a dozen more video histories of the iPhone. I've linked the main few in the description. Well, buckle up. Let's see how history makes more sense when we know that Apple's inner circle had the ideas for iTunes and the App Store early.
The iPhone is not just the best-selling gadget ever created. It's probably the most influential one too.
Apple wanted to do something not just a MP3 player. It actually took on the challenge of saving the music publishing industry.
The launch of the iTunes music service in 2001 allowed users to rip, burn and listen to individual music tracks legally and easily. It almost single-handedly pulled the rug from music pirates and paved the way for Apple's next hardware release. In October 2001, the iPod portable music player was released.
So the iPod was truly revolutionary. iTunes was a brilliant idea. iTunes and iPod function together. You can't have one without the other. Again, you suddenly had this closed proprietary system, but everyone wanted in.
Note how incredibly nimble that is of Apple. I gave them the idea of Apple brand power after the dot-com bust, and within a year, Apple was saved from bankruptcy. Brand power was a new concept, and marketing their brand allowed them to cross over from the Mac to the iPod. Mind you, it was not my idea, but I was a person that found it and brought it to the attention of Apple's upper management. That's not new news to me though. I already saw it at that time on the front cover of Forbes as the idea that saved Apple from bankruptcy only months after giving the idea. How can a company go from a branding idea and an iTunes concept to convincing their investors, creating iTunes software, and launching the iPod product all within a year? Outstanding. Let's continue the tape.
In 2004, 50% of Apple's revenue came from the iPod. From its first release in October of 2001 to implementing iTunes for Windows and it being a hit in 2003, it was already deemed vulnerable in 2004. The growing popularity of MP3 players in phones made Apple worried. And in the summer of 2004, the iTunes phone was born.
Hold the tape. iTunes on Motorola was intended to defend the iPod for music playing phones? Where's the differentiation? It's a complicated plan, but the difference is the iTunes plan. Note, iTunes brought legitimately licensed music. That's unique. And iTunes would let customers purchase music directly on their phone. That's unique too. But since we know that selling music from a phone was part of the plan for 3 years, since 2001, that makes sense. Music rights would be negotiated with publishers at the humble price model of the iPod. And everyone would be delighted later when iTunes launched on a successful phone, making the store more pervasive. Customers, music publishers, and investors would all be delighted with the more availability of the music. And Apple would be stronger, being a big player in music publishing. Hasn't it turned out that way even today? Apparently, it was a 3-year plan held in secret by Apple's inner circle. Okay, roll the tape again.
The rocker phone, that it was going to be called, was terrible.
The 3-year plan to roll out a cellular phone as a point-of-sales device for music, that is iTunes, was getting derailed. Could you imagine having to face the music producers with this failure? Those are big players. You couldn't just walk away. We're still in 2004 with this next video clip.
But a lot of executives tried to convince Jobs, and one of them was Mike Bell. He was convinced that the phones were heading into a new era and that they would be the next big thing. He said, "We were spending all this time putting iPod features in Motorola's phones. That just seemed ass backwards to me. If we just took the iPod user experience and some of the other stuff we were working on, we could own the market."
Put yourself in the timing of the idea. Mike Bell is talking about thinking that phones could eventually be big back in 2004. I gave the idea of the cellular phone being a point-of-sales device to Fred Hoare from Apple during the dot-com bust, so that was around 2001. But by that time, I had sat on the idea for 2 years already. In the video, Mike Bell was surprised to believe in the cell phone back in 2004. But we know that Apple's inner circle was already gathering music rights to be sold on a cellular phone back in 2001. We're very early with these ideas. It's like talking about AI in 2014, but that's another story. Let's go on.
And on November the 7th of 2004, Bell sent a late-night email. "Steve, I know you don't want to do the phone, but here's why we should do it. Johnny Ive has some really cool designs for future iPods that no one has seen. We ought to take one of those, put some Apple software around it, and make a phone out of it ourselves, instead of putting our stuff on other people's phones." Jobs would call him right away. They argued for hours, pushing back and forth, but eventually Steve came around. "Okay, I think we should do it."
When Mike Bell is representing his buddy from the iPod group, he mentions iPod on the Motorola, but where is iTunes in the conversation? After all, the Motorola is called the iTunes phone. Up to this point, employees believed that iTunes was only a strategy for the iPod, and indeed it was used that way, but it was destined for more. This feature successfully boosted the sales of the physical iPod, in spite of phone music players. But the iTunes phone would give a clue to the ultimate strategy. Just think from the iPod team's point of view. If you had iTunes on the Motorola and the phone had a music player, did you really need an iPod? Sure, the iPod would still be part of the iPod plus iTunes ecosystem, but it would have an increasingly difficult role remaining relevant. Hasn't it turned out that way today? But to Apple's inner circle, the iTunes phone was significantly about iTunes. The employees had not seen this part yet. iTunes on Windows was already successful in boosting iPod sales, but they had not yet seen the greater success of iTunes on the iPhone. Did you notice how the inner circle strategically used knowing the iTunes idea early? Secretly knowing the iTunes idea back in 2001, Apple was busy gathering music rights using the iPod. This activity paves the way for iTunes on the iPhone. and then for Apple to become a big player in music publishing. The employees not really knowing what iTunes was going to be about back in 2004 makes sense if it was kept a secret within Apple's inner circle. The iTunes phone would seem like an odd move to some employees, but it makes sense if you think of the iPod as a vehicle to stock iTunes with music content, not iTunes just supporting iPod sales. And eventually, iTunes would allow Apple to become a significant player in music publishing and help save the music industry from MP3 sharing. Shall we continue on?
When it finally got there, he didn't even want to show it on stage because he was so embarrassed by it, Fadell says. When Jobs got off stage, he was upset and angry. "This is not gonna fly. I'm sick and tired of dealing with Bosu handset guys," Jobs told Fadell after the demo. That was the ultimate thing, Fadell says. It was, this, we're going to make our own phone.
It was already decided to make an Apple phone, but this statement served to kick off the iPhone project. The employees would probably need a passionate message for the tough road ahead. But check out this video clip of a discussion with Bas Ording.
A couple of days after the iPhone project launched, he got a call from Jobs. "We're gonna do a phone. It's gonna have a small screen, it's gonna be just touchscreen. There's not gonna be any buttons, and everything has to work on that."
So, the touchscreen phone idea came from Steve Jobs. Steve already had some experience with the Newton.
The Newton was really, in some ways, a prototype iPhone, except that it couldn't make phone calls.
And remember the cell phone as a point-of-sales device? We'll see some design decisions where he was probably already thinking about the App Store at this point.
Founded in 1998 by Wayne Westerman, Fingerworks had figured out how to use a different type of technology effectively. It was called capacitive multi-touch. It was fast, responsive, precise, and most importantly, smart enough to recognize multiple fingers and what they were trying to do.
But back at the beginning, he had a company called Fingerworks, which is an independent company which Apple bought, part for the technology and part to get him because he was so talented.
Apple brings in a key technology and team to modernize the Newton. Also, this closes the gap in my contribution. I was concerned that there might have been an acquisition that would complicate my contribution to the iPhone. But since these acquisitions are hard to hide from employees, the employee histories closed the gap for me.
In the meantime, the macOS team built a phone with touchscreen that worked and looked amazing. When you touch the screen, it would track your finger perfectly. When you pull down, it will pull down. They saw it as an opportunity to use a phone-shaped device as a Trojan horse for a much more complex kind of mobile computer.
And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
The next year, Apple would release the iPhone 3G with a lowered price and the added App Store, which turned the iPhone into a global powerhouse. It would take years for any competition to come close to iPhone's success.
Why the complicated Mac OS for a fixed feature phone? Remember that Mac OS was originally designed for the Newton, a mobile computer. The Mac OS team recognized that the iPhone would be a stepping stone to a modernized Newton and its apps. And was the App Store successful? A global powerhouse, indeed. Why did it take the competition years to equal its success? It's tough to add the App Store with its ecosystem of developers. It took foresight to have the minimalistic UI and touchscreen buttons of the Newton. Android had to start over to get there.
Once the initial fanfare was over, the sales of the iPhone would be slow. It would take the introduction of the App Store in 2008 to really kick things off again for Apple. If it wasn't for the App Store, the iPhone could have just been one of those devices that looked cool and was cool to use, but never caught on. For an entire year after the iPhone's launch, it could run a grand total of 16 apps. There was only one home screen's worth of apps, and that was it.
So the App Store saved the iPhone from being a pretty novelty? How? Another plan to delight content providers, investors, and customers. By selling apps, Apple is constantly able to renew the life of the iPhone and generate revenue. And how important was it to have the App Store in mind from the beginning of the iPhone project?
But the difference was, for the first time, a device was now a changeable blank canvas with no buttons. Since the device could run apps on it, the iPhone's software creators could make it whatever they wanted it to be. Their creativity was only limited by their imagination and the hardware capability. Today, billions of apps have been sold, and the mobile app space has become a new industry.
We heard Steve Jobs at the beginning of the iPhone project asking Bas Ording to make a touchscreen phone with all the interface on the screen. And it would be based on Mac OS, an app-based operating system originally designed for the Newton. That was the best case phone if they could overcome the design issues. So the gap was closed for me as well. I was not a probable contributor to the iPhone, but without a reasonable doubt, I was a contributor to the iPhone. So let's recap on how did history remember the contributions of iTunes and the App Store. iTunes was the reason for the iPhone.
And in the summer of 2004, the iTunes phone was born. It was, this, we're going to make our own phone.
Touchscreen was the beauty of the iPhone.
A couple of days after the iPhone project launched, he got a call from Jobs. We're going to do a phone. It's going to have a small screen, it's going to be just touchscreen. There's not going to be any buttons, and everything has to work on that.
The App Store was the longevity of the iPhone.
Once the initial fanfare was over, the sales of the iPhone would be slow. It would take the introduction of the App Store in 2008 to really kick things off again for Apple. If it wasn't for the App Store, the iPhone could have just been one of those devices that looked cool and was cool to use, but never caught on. For an entire year after the iPhone's launch, it could run a grand total of 16 apps. There was only one home screen's worth of apps, and that was it.
Both iTunes and the App Store would give Apple additional momentum for the future.
In July 2008, Apple launched the App Store with 500 apps for the iPhone. In its first weekend, 10 million apps were downloaded. Like the success of iTunes before it, this was a key moment in the commodification of digital content and paved the way for future Apple products.
But I think there was a unique aspect to my role in the iPhone. If you think about the invention of the light bulb and the production of the light bulb, it's easy to separate the two. The invention was done in the lab and provided the motivation for the light bulbs that we see in the store. The production of the light bulb is all the design and the engineering that we see in the product. The iPod plus the iTunes was the reason for the iPhone, so I had a role in the first part. The beauty of the design was related to the second part. Let's listen to how this video gives a nod to both the invention of the idea of the iPhone as well as the creation of the product.
In this video, we would go through how they came up with the idea for the iPhone, and how they took that idea and created a product that revolutionized an entire market and our lives.
And this one also gives a nod to the invention idea as well as the builders of the product.
With over 2 billion units sold, the iPhone is the most influential product of all time. But where did it come from? If it wasn't a sudden idea from Steve Jobs, who actually came up with the idea? Who were the people that built it, and what are their stories?
I think the invention idea of the iPhone was based on good fundamentals that have held up well over time. And the beauty of the design is iconic, and a tribute to what can be done. Very nicely done all the way around here. A lot to admire, and a lot to learn from. There were many programmers and designers that contributed solutions and beautiful innovations to the build and production of the iPhone. It's too bad that so few of them were acknowledged by name. For everyone that was listed in these histories, I'm sure there were many more that were represented by them. Well, it's nice that my parts were treated so kindly by history. Wasn't that a fun journey? It was fun for me too. As a bonus, my father challenged me to teach how to do similar things on YouTube. Do you think it can be taught? I think I'm going to try and find out.